Hi, it's time for Mid-South Viewpoint. Welcome to the program today. I'm Byron Tyler. Glad you could join us. Dr. Larry Lloyd has an extensive urban ministry and nonprofit management experience spanning some 30 years. Larry, I believe it started with Young Life back in 1975, didn't it?
1975, Young Life Urban Ministries right here in Memphis, Orange Mound.
And so much has happened since those days. In 87, you helped create the Memphis Leadership Foundation. And I guess I was just recounting all of the things that this foundation has done. It's really pretty exciting to see what God has done through the MLF here.
And it surprises me, too. We never thought it would be as extensive as I think we've created about 30 some odd different inner city programs over that time.
You got the neighborhood housing opportunities, the Urban Youth Initiative, Christ Community Health Services, Memphis Athletic Ministries, for the Kingdom Camp and Retreat Center Streets. We've got Memphis Center for Urban Theological Studies, MCUT's the most recent one, or one of the most recent ones. And
more to come. We just are working with a couple other groups to incubate some new ideas, one called the Memphis Bike Ministry, using bike repair and to train young people, primarily in North Memphis right now, how to repair bikes. You know, biking is now the new thing in Memphis with the Green Line.
Oh, it's exciting, yeah.
And also doing bike rodeos in inner city communities where bikes have been absent simply because there's very little place to ride bikes and so forth. And so we're really excited about continuing to incubate new ideas.
Now, some $30 million plus have been available through the ministry. Like-minded believers and philanthropists have given to this work because they believe in what you're doing through the foundation and the results that we've seen already over the years through the foundation.
Yeah, I tried to add it up the other day since 1987, and it's probably closer to $75-80 million that have gone into inner city ministries through the foundation, the various programs that we've been able to incubate over that time.
And I just think this is really one of the best kept secrets, ministry-wise in our city that folks need to know about.
People know about us through the fruit, right? Everybody knows Streets and Memphis Athletic Ministries and MCUTs and Christ Community Health Services and et cetera, et cetera. So we are what you are called now an intermediary organization. We provide back office support. We provide incubation and capacity building and training to these various ministries. So it's not, we're not on the front line. We're behind the scenes as much as we can be.
Well, in addition to this work, you're also an ordained minister in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. Mm-hmm. You serve on staff over at Hope Presbyterian.
That's correct.
I know you teach some classes. I've talked to some folks that love to come to your classes. But what makes Larry a man above the norm is his wife, Becky.
Certainly.
And those 4 daughters.
All of whom are grown, and we got 4 granddaughters, and finally a grandson. So we're pretty excited about that.
Larry, isn't being a grandparent pretty fabulous?
It is not overrated.
It's not at all. I just had our first. She's 2 now, and
it's a blast.
It is a joy. You have just written a book called "Recovering from Racism," and the subtitle is "City Ministry in a Post-Racial America." Mm-hmm. And you've actually written this from your own experience, and that's why we're going to get together today. I'll just say this: normally, I don't do book reviews for this show because there's a lot to talk about, and I don't want to just promote a book. I think this book has a profound message, and we want to talk about it today. First of all, I would like for you to take us inside the Lloyd home where you grew up in Midtown Memphis, and what was life like for you growing up?
Well, I grew up during some turbulent times in terms of my teenage years during the civil rights struggle here in Memphis and throughout the country. 1968, I was in the 10th grade at Central High School. On the day that Dr. King was assassinated, I was practicing baseball for Central and didn't really know what was going on until I turned on the radio in the car going home and learned that Dr. King had been killed. And Central was a unique place in that our school was fairly desegregated. And being in relationship with blacks and whites, which, of course, in Memphis at that time, it was a city in black and white. It's much more diverse now than it was then. But just having grown up in a very conservative background where personal salvation was really the only thing we really talked about, and then Christian morality. We never really talked about ethics or justice in a way that I was hearing through the civil rights movement. And several of my friends at Central High School's parents were very involved in the civil rights movement, and I was able to sort of rub shoulders with some icons, really, in Memphis during the civil rights struggle. And here were men and women of faith, same faith I had, but with a very different perspective on how we lived out that faith in the midst of the civil rights struggle. And so growing up in Midtown, being at Central, relationships were the key in terms of interaction with people very different from me, and hearing really not a different gospel, but a gospel from a different side.
Okay.
And that really impacted me.
Do you remember the first interaction you had with somebody from a different race than you were?
Junior high. I also went to Snowden Junior High. And I believe in the seventh grade, desegregation happened at Snowden, Bellevue, Snowden, and Central, really, because of the location of those schools. And it was really through basketball. I played that sport through high school and college. It was really through that athletic relationship where I got to really get to know people very different from me. And so the first real memories would be in junior high.
Now, you say in your book that you had privileges based on nothing other than the fact that you were born white. What were some of those privileges, Larry?
Well, we think of that now. Several friends of mine who happen to be African-American have to teach their young boys to keep both hands on the steering wheel when they're stopped by the police, and to be very careful when they go into a store because they're being watched. I never had to worry about that. The police were my friends. In the African-American community, the police force was predominantly white until the 1970s. And so, we lived with a very different reality than African-Americans in this neighborhood or in this city. So when I talk about white privilege, I couldn't help being born white, but we are in a white male-dominated culture in the United States. It's increasingly becoming different than that. But just think of our state legislature. 80% of our state legislature are white men. Now, what voice do African Americans have in the state legislature? Very little. So when I talk about white privilege, it's the majority culture. And when you think of culture and subcultures, we're the dominant culture as white males. The subculture would be any culture of color. Well, if they're going to survive in a white male-dominated culture, they have to understand the predominant culture. But the white culture does not have to understand the subculture. Mm. And therein lies the issue of how we relate to one another. And that's crucial to understand the other culture, the subculture, so-called subculture, when you're in the dominant culture, if you're going to make a difference, if you're going to be a servant leader. And so white privilege simply means as a white American male, I have the world at my fingertips, so to speak. It's granted to me simply by the color of my skin.
Larry, you also talk about the old political system in our city that ruled and fueled the segregation issue.
If you think back during the Crump years, and even after that, until Fred Davis, Mr. Fred Davis, and Reverend Jim Netters and Reverend J.O. Patterson became council members, the whole political system was controlled by the white majority with no input at all from the African American community. Of course, that changed in the 60s when we went to a city council form of government. But the powers that be, particularly Mayor Loeb and his office, would not give in an inch to the sanitation strike's demands, or the sanitation workers' demands, which were very, frankly, very, very minimal, very modest. And by digging in his heels, we had a whole lot more divisive activity in our city than we needed to have. But it was that idea of not giving in that really, you look back on that and you kind of scratch your head and said, what were you thinking, right? And but that has, unfortunately, changed over the years. We have, obviously, African-Americans and white leadership and increasingly Latino leadership in our city that is rising to the top. You
painted a picture that brought back memories for me about our sanitation workers back, in those days. I was a little bit younger than you were, but I still remember, and I remember telling my sons this, and they, it was a surprise to them. that the sanitation workers, when you and I were growing up, actually had to, get off of their trucks with a little cart wheel and go up the drive in the backyard, maybe fight a dog or two. And in our case, our trash cans were behind the garage. And so, there was quite a bit of distance, and as you mentioned, and I remember those leaking cans that they would have to put on and get all over their clothes. And, just having to deal with that. There's so much has changed, thankfully, when it comes to that particular job. But, so many folks don't realize what these men had to put up with.
Well, yeah, those were aluminum tubs that all leaked during the summer. And so often the sanitation workers would wear coveralls to keep the stuff off them, but they weren't even allowed to take a shower back at the sanitation workers where they dropped the trucks off. The whites could go to shower before they went home. And you can just imagine the humiliation of a grown man having to get on a bus to go home smelling of garbage because he wasn't allowed to take a shower or get clean clothes or have a locker there at the sanitation workers' headquarters or maintenance shop. And they were no pension. Their benefits were almost zilch, limited. And yet it's the dirtiest job and the thankless job, but an important job in our city. And the reason the I Am a Man placards and it came out was they were not treated like men. And that's all they were asking, treat us like men. And unfortunately, it brought Dr. King to Memphis. That was not his plan. And unfortunately, of course, he died here, which was just in California delivering a paper at Fuller Seminary on urban ministry. And we are still known throughout this country as the place where Dr. King was killed.
Talk about the chasm of disinterest and disengagement that existed between the communities that you grew up in and where African Americans lived. In
the 60s, and I grew up in a conservative evangelical church and still consider myself an evangelical and conservative evangelical, we were silent during the civil rights struggle. We just did not get involved. And sometimes we were on the wrong side. Now, there certainly were a lot of white Memphians in mainline denominations that were very much involved in the justice issue of the civil rights movement. But somehow the evangelicals back in the 50s and 60s, we lost our way when it came to being salt and light in our culture. We really were just concerned about personal faith and personal ethics. And oftentimes the issues of justice, which are all over the pages of Scripture, meeting the needs of the poor, speaking out for those who are marginalized and have no voice, which is all throughout the Old and New Testament, we forgot that. We spiritualized it. Part of it's due to just the backlash against liberalism that came out of Europe in our seminaries. And I think we put our head in the sand because we really did feel like getting involved in social justice issues was not what Christians ought to do. And so we were silent, except on a few issues. Always we were very vocal on abortion and continue to be very vocal about same-sex marriage. And I wrote in the book about the time when a bunch of folks met down at City Council to protest the strip joints. And so we do know how to speak to certain issues, but we don't speak very loudly when it comes to the justice issues.
Do you think, Larry, it was out of fear of tainting its theology that the white evangelical church was a no-show in support of Dr. King's efforts for racial equality?
Yeah, you think back, Walter Rauschenbusch, who wrote the book The Social Gospel, who taught at Union Seminary up in New York, he's from Europe. That book really, he was post-millennial, saying that, if we just reform society, reform the hospitals and education, then we will bring God's kingdom to earth as it is in heaven without a second coming, so to speak. That's kind of the post-millennial position. And after World War II, it became obvious that we weren't getting any better. We were getting worse. And so the conservative evangelicals sort of, I think, said, all we care about is saving souls. Certainly that's priority. That's our priority. And we don't need to concern ourselves with reformation of society. Of course, there's all sorts of historical evidence. It was the church in England that led the charge against the abolition of slavery. It was the church that built hospitals. Hospitals are called hospices. They were all started by churches. Education, most of the colleges in this country, or the beginning of this country, the universities were started by churches. And so we have a long history of social involvement in Reformation, right? But we lost it in the early part of the 20th century. And we're just now, there were some great voices, John Perkins, Jim Wallace, Bill Pinnell, and others, Tom Skinner, Evangelical Associates, were talking about this from an evangelical perspective, but they were the lone wolves out there. We pretty much lost our way, and we're hopefully recapturing that now as we realize that we are here to not only preach the gospel, but to do the gospel.
Larry, give us some examples where the church has failed to show up in our city in the struggle for justice and community development. One
place where we did show up, where we failed, was in public education. When the Brown versus Board of Education said desegregation in public schools is no longer legal, we were not at the table. We started Citizens Against Busing schools. We started private schools. We left the city, white flight. All that happened in the 70s. We failed to be salt and light and how to make that work. That's just one issue. The second issue, there's all kind of issues. One is the criminal justice system. We are locking up African-American males at an alarming rate for longer sentences than ever before, and not giving. And these kids don't have any opportunities. Businesses have left the community. So when I talk about community development, some churches are very much involved in community development, but the redevelopment of neighborhoods, housing, job opportunities, education reform, health care, all these issues, the church is responding now. But in the past, these were not issues that the evangelical church concerned themselves with.
Maybe this is not our responsibility. Is it the government's responsibility?
Well, there's a book, I'm trying to think of the author, it'll come to me, The Tragedy of American Compassion, Marvin Olasky. He writes about the church's role in social work and social reform in this country, and he marks all the orphanages, all the hospitals, all started by conservative churches and synagogues. But when the government took over, we abdicated our responsibility. The church is the only one that has hope. Government programs don't have hope. That's just a Band-Aid. The church has the only remedy in any of these issues because it's the heart, the soul, and the mind, and the body that we take very seriously. So when the church, yes, the government has a role for sure. We pay taxes for the government to take such a role. But to abdicate our responsibility to the government is you can't square that with Scripture.
Larry, there's a reference in your book about the garbage in our lives that we all share no matter our skin color. And that garbage, selfishness, envy, hatred, and the list can go on and on. It's our own personal sin that we, as human race, deal with, not just particular skin color of race. Didn't Christ die for the human race in order to remove that garbage? That's in essence of what he did for us and for all of us.
Well, Jesus died to remove the garbage, to forgive the garbage, and then through sanctification remove the garbage and what's left over from the garbage. The problem is when the garbage becomes institutionalized, and there's where culture then can become just as dirty as our personal individual sin, when sin becomes corporate sin. Racism or prejudice, not liking someone or having ill feelings about someone because of their race or their education or their culture is one thing. When it becomes institutionalized through Jim Crow or through slavery, then that evil becomes an institutional evil that then becomes so ingrained in our culture that is hard to get rid of. But I believe only the people of God can rid the culture of that garbage because we have the answer. And that answer, of course, comes through the gospel. No one could have been more racially isolated than Jews and Gentiles when Paul wrote his letter to the Galatians, that in Jesus there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free man, Scythian or barbarian, male or female, we're all one in Jesus Christ. Now, Paul, when he said that culture was more torn along Jew-Gentile lines than we are black-white lines in Memphis. So if Paul can say that in his day, he's still telling us that in our day. He wants to clean up the garbage, and then he wants us to be the salt and the light that then further cleans up the garbage in our culture.
Larry, obviously we don't have time to talk about all the details of what goes into this book, but certain things I want to highlight. And I like the way you start to conclude the book about the healing process. I think that's important that we camp here just for just a second. And part of the healing process from racism, you say that you needed to expose yourself to the culture that you've wronged. How have you personally done that?
The idea of culture, subculture. The dominant culture does not have to understand the subculture in order to survive, but the subculture must understand the dominant culture if they're going to survive. So what I've done in that light, or the positive, is read everything I could, invest in relationships with people different than me, allowing them to speak into my life. I have 4 mentors in my life, all happen to be African-American men: John Perkins, Bill Pinnell, Fred Davis, and Burley Sangster. And I learned to listen to them early on, because only through listening to their point of reference will I ever be able to come close to understanding their culture. And so listening is the first, listening and reading. Getting it's wonderful literature for instance, Beyond the Mayflower is a American history from the African American perspective. You need to read that if you want to understand what it meant to live in this country as an African American slave, and on through the history. So by reading and by listening and by involving yourself in relationships with people different from yourself, that's the beginning point.
You also emphasize the importance of compassionate relationships, and you break down the Greek word for compassion, meaning that we enter a deep identification with people who are in pain or need. And that's exactly what Jesus did for us, and he calls us to do the same for people.
In Mark chapter 1, when the leper approaches Jesus, says, "If you're willing, will you make me clean?" It says Jesus filled with compassion. Unfortunately, some of the older translations say pity. But when he says filled with compassion, it means he was moved in his very gut and did something. So compassion always leads to action. Pity doesn't lead to anything except feeling sorry for someone. That doesn't do any good. Compassion is entering into the other person's pain and reality, and living with that, not necessarily trying to solve anything, but just identifying with that pathos.
And that's powerful. It really, really is. And we need a lot more compassion, as you well stated there. What was the most difficult chapter for you to write in this book?
Getting started. I'm not an author. I've written a lot of papers in the seminary and so forth, but writing a book is you got to put chapters together and so forth. But probably the hardest part is that last part. How do you really take these issues and move toward reconciliation, move toward a better understanding, move toward repentance, forgiveness, and confession? Because a lot of this comes from my own experience, and I don't know that my experience is going to be the same as anybody else's. But I know what it took for me, which is relationships, listening, coming alongside rather than top down but bottom up.
What I think I like really most about this book, again, your book, Recovering from Racism, Larry, is, again, how you put it in first person. It's my sin. This is how I dealt with my sin, And we all have to do that individually, Relate to it as our own personal sin before God and for our fellow man.
Yeah, it's interesting when I talk to folks about them, because a lot of this comes out of lectures at churches or Sunday school classes. When someone says, well, I'm not a racist, I'm colorblind. So, well, first of all, you're not colorblind. That's stupid. And no one's colorblind. We want to embrace other cultures. We want to celebrate what's good in every one of our cultures. I mean, there's good and bad in every culture. What's beautiful about that culture is to be embraced. And so when folks say, I'm not a racist, I'm not colorblind, or I'm colorblind, my first step is, well, if you're white and grew up in the South You were raised in a superior position. And so just face that and then ask the question, what will I do with that? I didn't ask to be born white. I didn't ask to be, if I was in Africa places, I wouldn't have white privilege. So I have white privilege. So what I'm going to do with that? How will I steward that as a child of God in a way that makes a difference in our city?
What do you hope, Larry, that this book, Recovering from Racism, will transfer into the lives of those who read the book?
My target audience really was not yours and my age group. It's not that we're too far gone, but I see so many young people, white and black, and Asian and Latino, who really want to embrace our city. We're seeing people relocate into areas that they probably would not have chosen to live, or their parents wouldn't have chosen to live in. We see, like Downline Ministries, Memphis Teacher Residency Program, all these the doctors at Christ Community Health Services are coming and wanting to make a difference in their city. And the idea behind the book is that's great, but don't forget the past because you'll make the same mistakes we made. So here's some tools that you can use to begin to grow as you really want to impact the city. And it cannot be paternalistic. It's got to be what I call bottom-up theology instead of top-down.
Where can we find the book?
Amazon.com has them, but the easiest place to get it is at Seattle Book Publishing Company. That's who published it. SeattleBookCompany.com is the quickest, most sure. Amazon, they'll buy a bunch of books and sell them, and then they'll wait until some other orders come in. Then they'll do another wholesale order. So you're liable to have to wait at Amazon, but Seattle Books would get it right to you. And it's on Kindle as well. And
if somebody wanted you to come maybe speak to their church civic group, are you open to that?
Certainly. I've done that quite a bit over my last 40 years. I continue to I love to talk about the message of reconciliation.
And what's the best way to contact you?
Well, the best way is by email, larry@mlfonline.org. I'm much more attuned to email than I am phone calls.
Dr. Larry Lloyd, I just want to thank you for what you're doing for Christ's kingdom when it comes to racial reconciliation, especially in our city of Memphis. Thank you for being our guest today here on Bott Radio Network.
Thank you so much.
Friends, that's all the time we have on this edition of Mid-South Viewpoint. I do hope you'll check out the book, Recovering from Racism, by Larry Lloyd, our guest today on Mid-South Viewpoint. That's all the time we have. We'll talk to you next time. I'm Byron Tyler. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.